Hey, what you reading for?
Hello and welcome back for part 2, where I take you into my Goodreads account and show you all the books I have given 5 stars. Please remember to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, buy my books. Descriptions and links are in the show notes, or you can find them through Amazon as ebook or paperback. Now,
shall we begin?
We'll kick things off with The Stepford Wives by Ira Levin. I love The Stepford Wives. This is a short book, a novella, 120 pages or so. Not a wasted word in it. It's incredibly layered. It is a satire of consumerism and a condemnation of the subjugation of women. It's also an excellent sci-fi read with legitimate scares. Next, M. Butterfly by David Henry Hwang. I love this play, maybe my favorite play of all time. This is based on a true story. There's a real-life French diplomat or accountant with the Foreign Affairs Service, I believe, and he was caught giving away state secrets, sensitive information to a Chinese spy. And he did this out of a combination of white colonial guilt and questions about his sexuality. This is a brilliant example of a character, a protagonist and narrator in this case, who is willfully ignorant. It is fascinating. Like his brain just refuses to deal with reality, and I love that. I always find characters who disregard reality, I find them very interesting. Unfortunately, this is a real life person, but in a work of fiction, as the play is, it's highly entertaining. Next up, we have Hangs a Man by Shirley Jackson. Now, this was her second novel, and it's quite experimental. It's relatively short, 300 or so pages. Nothing happens, and it's riveting. I love this book. This is an example of a book that, while I was reading it, I liked it, but I wasn't loving it. I mean, it is quite slow, not much in the way of the plot, and it's kind of experimental. So I liked it without loving it, but the book just planted so many seeds in my brain, and I think about it often. In fact, I've gone back since then to reread it, and I've written essays about it and study guides for it. I think it's an absolutely fascinating book, especially if you are interested in dark academia. I think that it is one of the best examples of that subgenre. Love Shirley Jackson. Moving on, we have O Alienista by Brazilian writer Machado de Assis. So in English, this book is called The Alienist, which is an old-timey word for psychiatrist. And this book was first published in 1881. And it is a novella, a satirical work, quite humoristic, that parodies or satirizes this quirky trend that was sweeping Europe called psychology. We are all familiar with the adage, "For he who has a hammer, every problem is a nail." So in this story, there's a psychiatrist who moves to a small town in Brazil, and he gets a hammering, and it's a lot of fun. Next, we have Haroun and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie. Now, this was my first experience with Salman Rushdie, and I just loved the wordplay, the humor, the magic, and the fantasy, the different worlds that this little child goes to explore on his adventure. I first came across this book at a yard sale in France, so my first experience was in French, and then several years later, I was living in Brazil, and I read the book again in Portuguese, and I was so impressed at how both translations, how they were able to capture the wordplay and the humor. I have yet to read this book in English. Maybe I will one day, but I'm sure it's great in English. It's great in Portuguese and French too. Next up, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Wow, this is a spectacular debut novel from a spectacular writer. It is not an easy read. She deals with some very powerful and very disturbing subjects. Society's conception of beauty and how that is imposed on young women, and how that expectation or that view of beauty is used to subjugate or denigrate women of color. And it is very powerful read. Next up, we have A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. This is the second example of a work of nonfiction on my list, which is a surprisingly high number, 2 examples, given my militant resistance to reality. This was a very important book to me because when I was growing up, I was not really that into science. I was more into arts, music and art, poetry, that sort of thing. And this book opened up to me how much creativity there is in the world of science. That was my biggest takeaway from this book. It was eye-opening in that regard. How you have to really imagine and think about different models of the universe in order to formulate a hypothesis, and then to imagine and be creative so that you can design experiments to test these hypotheses. It was eye-opening in that regard and a great read. Next up, we have The Contortionist's Handbook by Craig Clevenger. This is Craig Clevenger's debut novel. He's put out 3 books. All 3 of his books are excellent. I am shocked that he is not more famous and not more highly regarded and widely read than he is, because he is exceptional. The Contortionist's Handbook might be my favorite of his 3, but that's also probably because it was the first that I read from him, and your first is always going to be special. If you are a fan of Chuck Palahniuk, you should also check out Craig Clevenger. I do think there are similarities in their work. This is a man who's being interviewed by a hospital psychiatrist. He was admitted to hospital following an overdose, and the psychiatrist needs to determine whether this overdose was intentional or accidental. Next up, Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. Loved this book. This is a book about people living in New York City, people who are willfully ignoring reality. Again, that's a theme that is always going to work on me. But here, these people, they have difficult situations, especially the female lead, Holly Golightly. She comes from a rough background, and she's gotten herself mixed up in some unpleasant things. But she chooses not to think about them, but instead put a positive spin on everything. And this kind of attitude seems to permeate and influence those around her. So everyone around her is just kind of going through life with blinders and choosing to be optimistic when reality would suggest otherwise. And this willful disregard for reality, that is a theme that is always going to play nicely with me in literature, and I think is done exceptionally well in this book. There is a little bit of sadness to the book because you do realize that what these characters are living is not true. So there is some sadness, but there's also some joy in that they manage to, despite what reality gives them, they manage to put a positive spin on it, even if it is borderline delusional. Moving on, All My Sons by Arthur Miller. Now, I know that this play is rather cliche. I know that it is brazenly pulling on obvious heartstrings. But I'll be honest with you, I was not able to resist. It worked on me. A great read. There's some good tension throughout, and it raises interesting points. Next up, we have Mr. Be Gone by Clive Barker. Mr. Be Gone is one of his more divisive books. Either you love it or you hate it, and you'll find out very quickly, like within the first 5 to 10 pages, because the book addresses the reader and it implores the reader to burn the book because the book is possessed by a demon. I found the whole conceit fantastic and inventive and creative, and I was all in, and I had a blast. Next up, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Это есть наш последний и решительный бой с интернациональным восприятием род людской. Next up, we have The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran. So this is another book that I read when I was a teenager. When I was going through my fascination with mystics and mysticism, although I would not consider Kahlil Gibran in that category, but still he deals with spirituality and such. And I was a huge fan of Kahlil Gibran as a teenager. I still am. I have not looked at this book since I was a teenager, and I'm honestly afraid to, because it is such a simple book, almost reads like a devotional, and I'm just worried that it would not work on me now as an adult, as a jaded adult. And I feel like looking at this book now, it would just remind me of just how much innocence I have lost, the childlike wonder, how it so thoroughly has died in me. I think The Prophet would illustrate that point. Now, if I were to read it, I would think I would just, this is so simple and naive and lacks subtlety. But as a teenager, I was reading it, so wow, this is so simple and naive and it lacks subtlety. But people change, and people get jaded. Maybe if I read it again in the right frame of mind, I might be able to enjoy it again. I'm skeptical about that, but I do look back fondly, and I remember when I didn't have so much cynicism in my heart, and I loved The Prophet. Next up, we have Choke by Chuck Palahniuk. Now, this is by far my favorite of all the Chuck Palahniuk books. I haven't read them all, maybe 7 or 8 of them. I have the feeling that Chuck Palahniuk's first book, Fight Club, was such a huge hit, and it's very good. It's not a perfect book, though. I have a feeling that Chuck Palahniuk, he spent the next few years rewriting Fight Club, taking the same format and the same characteristics that made Fight Club so good. He kept writing with that same format and those same characteristics, trying to perfect the formula, if you will. I mean, with Invisible Monsters and Survivor, and then Choke was his 4th book. And these are all essentially rewrites of Fight Club in a way. And I think with his 4th try with Choke, I think he nailed it. And maybe Chuck Palahniuk agrees to some extent with what I'm saying, because after Choke, he switched gears and started dabbling in horror with Lullaby and Haunted and so forth. And he's gone on to have a very successful and varied career. But for me, Choke is the standout from his catalog. Next up, To Kill a Mockingbird by Lee Harper. And I remember reading this as a teenager, and I don't really remember that much about the book, except I remember how much I loved it. How much I just thought it was such a pleasant read and an impactful read. Next is Psycho by Robert Bloch. A work of horror, a classic work of horror. And this book was a lot of fun. As much fun as you could have following the exploits of a serial killer, which apparently is a lot of fun. There's the movie also, which I thought was excellent. It is the same story as the book, however, a very different tone. Whereas the movie is quite glamorous with beautiful actors and such, the book is dirty and grimy, and it smells swampy. I loved it. Next, we have La Chute by Albert Camus. And La Chute in English is called The Fall. It's a short book. It's essentially a story of a man in Amsterdam. He's at a bar and he's telling the story to the guy next to him, who may or may not be there. I mean, the narrator is kind of crazy. He might just be talking to himself. And this narrator, he presents Amsterdam in a way that is similar to Dante's Nine Circles of Hell. Like that plan, that map is superimposed on the city of Amsterdam. And the narrator recounts an anecdote where he's walking down the street and he hears somebody fall into one of the canals. Except he doesn't go and save them and see what the problem is and offer assistance. Instead, he just goes on his way. So that incident confronted him with his cowardice in a way that he can't accept. So there's some cognitive dissonance going on in his head that he's trying to work out, basically because he's realizing that he's a coward, and that's too much for him to deal with. Next, we have The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I need to read more from Kazuo Ishiguro. I probably need to read everything he's ever written, because The Remains of the Day was my first with him, and the second was Never Let Me Go. Both excellent books. My preference is for The Remains of the Day, and what I loved about this book is the subtlety and how the book leads the reader into reading between the lines and appreciating what is not said or what is understated. It's a great, tremendous achievement, literary achievement, I think. Next up, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. Excellent book. This book is narrated by a young boy who is on the spectrum, who has Asperger's syndrome. So this book gives the reader, or gave me, a very different perspective on the world, one that I hadn't really considered much and one that I hadn't experienced. And that's a great thing about literature, about fiction. It can put you in somebody else's skin, put you in somebody else's perspective, and get you to experience the world through different eyes, which helps the reader explore and develop their empathy and their imagination. And this book is a great example of that, because it was quite a unique read for me. And I thoroughly appreciated it. And I won't lie to you, I had some tears in my eyes at the end. Yep. Next up, we have Le Chercheur d'Or by Nobel Prize laureate J.M. Leclésio. In English, this book is called The Prospector. This is not a great title, but that's what it's called. This book is about a young boy on the island of Rodriguez, which is a French island in the Indian Ocean. And he decides to set out in search of a pirate treasure that his father is always raving about. But that's just the pretext for the book. The book is really about this young boy and his love for this island and his love for the water and for nature, and just how he's just curious about life and curious about discovering life. And it's just beautiful, very touching and beautiful story that manages to capture that wide-eyed wonderment of a child and the enthusiasm and curiosity with which they explore the world. Next, we have Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk, by Nobel Prize laureate Olga Tokarczuk. This book immediately reminded me of Shirley Jackson and her writing and her themes of magical thinking and women protagonists who aren't taken too seriously, and a little bit of satire on society. And this book, it features an elderly woman as the protagonist, and she is constantly making horoscopes for people and giving it to them unsolicited, right? And people just brush her off or blow her off because she's an old lady and she's alone, so she doesn't matter. And at the same time, there's a little mystery going on because people in this small village in the mountains of Poland, right on the border of Czechia, people start dying in suspicious ways. So there's a little bit of mystery going on there, and the mystery works. But for me, what was so appealing about this was the writing style and just the character study of this older woman. Lots of fun. I need to read more from Olga Tokarczuk. But I've been saying that for a while. One of these days, I'm actually going to do it. Next, we have Room by Emma Donoghue. Now, this is a tough read because it is about a woman who's being held against her will, and she's being kept in a room, and she gives birth to a boy while in captivity. And so we get kind of the young boy's 5 years old. We get the story from his perspective, and the room for him is the entire world. So it's a tough read, but it's very well done. Next, we have The Ritual by Adam Neville. This is a legitimately scary book. And it's a group of friends. They go hiking in the woods in Sweden, and they decide to take a shortcut, and things go very badly for them. Very well written, very well paced, and quite scary as well. Next, we have The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is a beautiful love story, essentially. This is two boys who grow up, they start as friends, and they grow up together and become lovers, and then they go off to war. And so we've got gallantry, we have this blossoming love, and we have conflict between the son and the mother, and the son and the father. This book has a lot going for it. This was Madeline Miller's first book. Her second book, Circe, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was also quite good. But that was a few years ago. And so I and many other fans are eagerly awaiting her third offering, which I suspect will be very good as well. Next, we have Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, the sequel, loosely related sequel to The Shining. I definitely prefer Dr. Sleep to The Shining, by the way, controversial take. But this book, what really worked for me on this book is the central character is dealing with alcoholism, and the way that this book deals with the problems and the consequences of addiction, and also fighting this stranglehold that addiction can have on you. I thought it was very well done, and it was actually quite touching. So love me some Dr. Sleep. Next, we have La Vie Devant Soi by Romain Gary, or Émile Ajar, as it was initially published. This book from 1975, it has an English translation called The Life Before Us. Just not, again, I don't love the title of that translation. But this is a French classic. This was a huge hit when it came out, won many literary prizes, and now it's being taught in schools and such. It's brilliant. It's set in Paris in the 1960s, I want to say late 60s, maybe early 70s. And it features an old Jewish woman who lives on the top floor of this building that doesn't have a lift, no elevator. And she is not well, she's sick, she's dying, but she doesn't want to go to hospital. She prefers to die at home, in her home, right? And she is visited regularly by a orphan street kid, this Arab street kid. So this book is filled with dichotomies. We have the older Jewish woman at the end of her life, and we have this young Arab man just starting off his life. And the two, they come together out of loneliness, out of a need to connect with others. And they come together and they form a beautiful relationship in this very sad, but also heartwarming story. Next, we have A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. So what this book manages to do so well that I appreciated was it manages to mix critical thinking with superstitious thinking. And it does so in order to create a horror story about exorcisms and demon possession, but it does so in a way that is not goofy or I would say irresponsible, even, because exorcisms are child abuse, and treating them like legitimate solutions to a real problem, which they're not. I feel like that's irresponsible. I think a lot of horror creators do that, which is not good. Paul Tremblay, however, shows us with this A Head Full of Ghosts that it's possible to be respectful and be responsible and still be scary and effective. Moving on, we have, I'm doing a lot of preaching in these videos. This is not cool. But I have opinions that I want to share. I guess that's why I created this channel. Anyway, moving on, we have Emma Donoghue again with selected plays. Now, I talked about this a little bit in the last video because one of the plays in this collection is Ladies and Gentlemen, but which is 5 stars, but also the collection as a whole, 5 stars. And this play features, each play in the collection features a female protagonist, a lesbian, and some of the plays are historical fiction, and there's also a retelling of a fairy tale, and there's also one contemporary piece as well. Enjoyable and emotionally impactful plays, all of them, especially Ladies and Gentlemen, but all of them. Next up, we have Playthings by Alex Feby. Now this is, I think this is Alex Feby's first book, and it is based on a true story, based on a German judge at the turn of the 20th century who started suffering from dementia, or starting really going insane, actually. So he was placed into an insane asylum, and but because he was a judge and he had a lot of money, he was placed in one of the better insane asylums of the time. But at that time, there weren't really good insane asylums. I'm not sure if there are today either. But this book is very effective because it shows his decline in sanity, and it manages to blend, I mean, there are passages that are quite humoristic, emotionally impactful or sad, and then there are passages that are quite scary, and it just manages to combine all these different tones and portray a very real, very human, and very dark experience. Next up, we have, again, Emma Donoghue, The Wonder, which is, I think, my favorite of her novels, at least. This is a great example of what Emma Donoghue does so well. She creates characters and puts them in a setting, a unique or interesting backdrop, which is already rife with tension, and then she presents these characters with a moral dilemma that seems to me, the reader, seems impossible to resolve. Yet she forces the characters to make decisions, for better or worse, and then we are left as the reader to examine those decisions and put ourselves in their place and try to imagine what we would do and if we would have better results than them. And The Wonder is an excellent example of that. Next, we have No Exit by Taylor Adams. This is a thriller. I was so surprised with this book. I went into the read because there was another booktuber who was praising it, and that booktuber was Mindy's Book Journey. And the way she described the book and her enthusiasm, it sold me on it, so I went out and read it, and I loved it. And I'm very surprised because I generally don't read thrillers, and the few times that I do, they don't work on me. But this book definitely did work on me. The execution is spotless. Every page is full of tension, and I really liked the central protagonist. Excellent book. And lastly, we have The Reddening by Adam Neville. Easily the scariest book I have ever read. And this was my first experience with Adam Neville's writing. And I've since gone on to read all 12 of his novels and have loved them all. The Reddening is still my favorite. Ancient things resurfacing, a cult, and people in a small isolated town who are willing to kill to keep their secret hidden. This book has a lot going for it. So there it is. Those are all the books thus far that I have given 5 stars to. And hopefully that list will increase as I keep reading. I have yet to have a 5-star read this year in 2025, but that will come soon, I hope. Do you have any experience with the books I talked about in this video? I would love to hear your opinions and your reactions, your feedback. I look forward to connecting with you in the comment section. Thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.